They called it networking. They called it philanthropy. They called it strategy. But what it really was access. Secret access to the most powerful politicians on the planet, in rooms where the cameras never followed, on planes where the manifests were edited, on islands where the only real rule was that nothing ever left. If there had been an honest title on those invitations, it would have read, very simply, Secret Meetings with the World's Most Powerful Politicians. And once you see how those meetings worked, you do not unsee it. It did not start on an island. It almost never starts with the scandal. It starts much smaller. It starts at charity galas, at fundraisers, at the back tables of private clubs in New York and Palm Beach, where the wine is expensive, the lighting is soft, and the conversations are louder than anyone wants to admit. You have a man who has already pleaded guilty in a sex case. His name is whispered, joked about, brushed aside as a complicated situation. Yet he still somehow has presidents, ex-presidents, princes, finance ministers, central bankers, tech billionaires, and media moguls answering his calls. That is not an accident. That is a system. In those circles, reputation is a commodity, but access is the real currency. Think about that. If a convicted sex offender can still walk into a room where heads of state are mingling with billionaires, what does that say about the people who keep inviting him? Either they did not care, or they cared but decided the benefits outweighed the disgust. Sometimes they dressed it up as global development or education initiatives. Sometimes they called it philanthropy and turned it into a glossy photo opportunity, complete with speeches about empowering youth and protecting the vulnerable. The brochures looked clean. The flight logs did not. You had photographs of him with one president at a charity event, smiling like an old friend. You had another former president documented on his private jet, logged in flight records that were never meant to be internet headlines. There were images of a royal prince strolling through New York with him, or visiting his homes, pretending it was all just social. There were tech founders and Ivy League professors and global bankers sitting at his dinner table. They talked about science, about policy, about money, about girls in the most sanitized way possible. They told themselves they were different, that they were not part of whatever other side of him existed. That is how denial works at that level. And then there was Donald Trump. Trump did what Trump always does. He treated the relationship like a performance. In the old days, before the mugshot, before the island became shorthand for horror, Trump was completely comfortable being on the record calling Jeffrey Epstein a terrific guy. He joked that Epstein liked beautiful women as much as he did, and that many of them were, in Trump's own words, on the younger side. That is not a conspiracy theory, not a rumor whispered in a hallway. That came out of his own mouth in an interview. The kind of throwaway brag he never imagined would come back as evidence of anything. Back then, the two of them moved through overlapping circles like planets in the same toxic solar system. Palm Beach, New York, Mar-a-Lago. There were parties at Trump's properties where Epstein was not some shadowy stranger. He was a regular. Photographs show Trump, Melania, Epstein, and Ghislaine Maxwell all standing together at Mar-a-Lago. The body language casual, the smiles automatic, the atmosphere, that strange mix of boredom and danger that lives in certain rooms. Flight logs later showed Trump on Epstein's jet in the 1990s. They were not strangers. They were not distant acquaintances. They were close enough to travel together, to share space where the doors closed and the cameras stayed outside. Behind those doors, the conversations did not sound like carefully managed press conferences. They sounded like what they were, powerful men talking as if the world belonged to them. Picture a private room at Mar-a-Lago, a long table, the hum of the air conditioning, phones left outside for security, staff hovering at a respectful distance, Trump at the head of the table, telling stories, testing reactions, throwing out insults, and watching who laughs. Epstein a few chairs down, part of the orbit, listening, nodding, occasionally chiming in with data points about someone's net worth, someone else's personal vulnerabilities, some new idea for education that conveniently required him to be at the center. At first, the talk is business, markets, real estate, who is buying what, which regulation might get weakened after the election, which foreign leader is looking for a back channel. Then, slowly, the conversation slides into politics in its rawest form. Who is running? who can be bought, who needs a favor, who needs pressure. There are jokes about a senator with a gambling problem, a governor with a secret investment, a cabinet official who drinks too much. Somebody mentions a journalist who is getting too close on a story, and everyone at the table smirks. It is all wrapped in laughter, but the message underneath is simple. These men believe they are operating above consequence. In that world, Epstein's value is not just money, it is connectivity. He can introduce a former president to a hedge fund billionaire. He can connect a royal to a promising education project that doubles as a pipeline of prestige. He can arrange a quiet dinner between a tech chief executive and a regulator, framed as philanthropy, but really about data and power. He becomes the guy who knows everyone, who can make things happen, who can whisper, "Look, I know this sounds difficult, but I can get you in the room." That kind of access is addictive. It makes powerful men ignore the police reports, the court records, the victim statements, because the cost of walking away feels too high. Bill Clinton flew on his jet multiple times. The flights were documented. The photos exist. Clinton later denied any knowledge of Epstein's crimes and said he was simply working on charitable projects. Maybe he believed that at the time. Maybe he told himself that. But the simple fact is this: a former president chose to associate repeatedly with a man whose behavior was already, at minimum, extremely suspicious. And he was not alone. European royals did the same. Finance ministers did the same. Executives did the same. Even after Epstein's 2008 plea deal publicly branded him as a sex offender, some of the world's most powerful people kept answering his invitations. There are stories that circulate inside that world, stories that are half rumor, half memory, impossible to fully verify. One version goes like this. At a private dinner in Manhattan, years after the first conviction, a European official makes a dark joke about the island. The table goes quiet for a second. A billionaire glances at Epstein, as if waiting to see whether to laugh or walk away. Epstein just smiles slightly and says, "Some places are exclusive for a reason." The tension breaks, the conversation moves on, and the story lives on as one more whispered anecdote about how normal it had become to treat something monstrous as an inside joke. Whether that exact line was ever spoken, only the people in that room truly know. But the pattern it represents, that is very real. Trump's part in all of this has two phases. In the first phase, he is the loud friend. He happily shares the stage, the parties, the social cachet. He invites Epstein into his world when it is fun, when the cameras are flattering, when the women are treated as decoration, and no one is asking hard questions. In the second phase, he is the amnesiac. Once Epstein's crimes become impossible to ignore, once victims go to court, once journalists start digging in earnest, Trump begins the familiar routine. First, he insists he barely knew him. Then he claims he heroically banned him from Mar-a-Lago over some unspecified incident. Then he pivots, pointing at his political enemies, insisting that they, not he, are the ones with something to hide. He turns the whole thing into a political weapon, promising his supporters that he will declassify everything, that he will expose every name in every file, that he alone will bring full transparency. He talks about his opponent's connections to Epstein, but glosses over his own. He pretends that the pictures, the quotes, the flight logs are all minor details or media distortions. That is how you know this is not just a story about one depraved man in a private island. It is a story about how power protects itself by rewriting its own history in real time. Even after Epstein's final arrest, after mugshots and court appearances, after he was found dead in his cell under circumstances that fueled 1,000 theories, the network did not simply evaporate. It recoiled. It went quiet. Lawyers went to work. Publicists drafted statements. Some powerful people said they had barely met him. Others expressed shock and regret. Files remained sealed. Victims kept pushing. Judges weighed transparency against privacy and security. Slowly, more documents were unsealed. More names appeared in court transcripts. Each new release sent a ripple of panic through old circles, even among those who had already tried to rewrite their stories. As political pressure grew, as victims demanded full disclosure, as commentators asked why so much remained hidden, the demand for a real accounting reached Washington. Calls for releasing the full investigative files, the grand jury materials, the internal memos grew louder. Finally, A new transparency law forced the Justice Department to begin releasing a vast cache of Epstein-related records, with victims' identities protected, but the broader picture laid bare. It was not an act of generosity. It was an act of pressure, public pressure, political pressure, legal pressure. Some say Trump signed on to it because he had no choice, because blocking it outright would have made him look even more scared. Others claim he believed he could spin whatever came out as proof of his enemy's corruption. Both motives can be true at the same time. When those records began to surface, they did not tell a neat story. They painted a messy, disturbing, deeply interconnected picture of wealth, power, and silence. There were internal emails about why a particular deal had been cut. There were memos about immunity agreements that seemed far too generous. There were hints of conversations between prosecutors and defense teams that left ordinary people wondering whether justice had ever really been the point. And woven through it all, there were the networks, the familiar names who had stayed close, who had continued to meet, to email, to attend events, even after the world had every reason to shun him. In some of the newly examined material, Trump appeared not just as a footnote, but as a recurring presence in Epstein's social map, not as a conspirator proven in court, but as a powerful friend who gave Epstein credibility simply by being in the same frame. Earlier comments about younger women were read in a harsher light. Photos that once looked like just another night at a club now look like pieces of a larger pattern. A birthday note with a crude sexual drawing and Trump's stylized signature became part of the public conversation, one more artifact of a culture that treated women's bodies as a joke, a prop, a canvas for ego. Somewhere between the confirmed documents and the gray zone of rumor, more stories accumulated. A staffer at a private club later claimed that, on one particularly tense night, a famous guest arrived shaken after seeing something he should not have seen at a different property. He reportedly muttered that if the tapes ever came out, half this town would move to another planet. Were there tapes, cameras, blackmail material? Some investigators believe Epstein kept recordings in safe deposit boxes in hidden rooms. Others say the evidence for that is murky, incomplete, more smoke than fire. The truth, inconveniently, sits somewhere between fear and proof. In that uncertainty, conspiracy theories thrive, and yet the core fact remains. Enough powerful people behaved as if there might be compromising material out there that the fear itself became part of the story. What is not uncertain is how many people looked away, how many saw the pattern and shrugged, how many believed victims only after the second, third, 10th wave of reporting, how many political leaders waited until it was safe, until the tide of public opinion had shifted, before expressing outrage, and how many, including Trump, weaponized the scandal, pointing fingers outward, using survivors' trauma as ammunition in their own political wars, while never seriously examining their own role in building that world. Trump supporters often argue that he is being targeted unfairly, that everyone who ever met Epstein is now being smeared. But there is a difference between brushing shoulders with someone once at a crowded event and moving in the same circles for years. There is a difference between being photographed at a gala and inviting that person repeatedly into your homes and your clubs and your private rooms. There is a difference between ignorance and willful blindness. When Trump jokes on camera about knowing Epstein's taste for younger women, when he brags and smirks and performs, he is not just a random bystander. He is actively normalizing something that should never have been treated as a joke. And here is the uncomfortable part. He is not the only one. The network that surrounded Epstein was not a one-man show. It was a culture, a structure, a set of incentives that told powerful men they could do almost anything and still be welcomed into polite society as long as they stayed useful. If they brought donations, if they delivered votes, if they opened doors, that is why some of them kept calling him even after his conviction. That is why they kept visiting his homes. That is why they were still emailing him about projects and proposals and introductions long after the rest of the world had enough information to be horrified. The unsealed files, the testimonies, the leaks, the investigative work, they all point in the same direction. Epstein mattered to these politicians and power brokers, not just because he was rich, but because he was a hub in a shadowy, informal network where favors flowed and secrets pooled. In that kind of world, a man who knows your secrets is a threat, but he is also an asset. And men like Trump, who have spent their entire careers testing boundaries and gaming systems, understand that dynamic instinctively. So when Trump now stands on a stage and demands that every name and every file be revealed, when he swivels the spotlight onto his enemies and calls them monsters, it is worth pausing. Just stop and ask. If he truly wanted total transparency, why did it take this long? Why did documents stay sealed for years? Why was there so much foot dragging when it came to releasing records? Why did he only lean into the transparency angle when it could be weaponized against rivals? The timeline matters as much as the talking points. In the end, the story of these secret meetings is not just about one island, one jet, one townhouse, one monstrous man. It is about the architecture of impunity built around him. It is about how easily a convicted sex offender could move among the most powerful people on earth and be treated as a benefactor, a connector, even a friend. It is about how often money and proximity to power outweighed basic morality. And it is about how a man like Donald Trump could be both a beneficiary of that system and, later, one of its loudest, most cynical narrators. There will always be details we do not have. There will always be stories that live only in half, remembered conversations and anonymous accounts. Some of the most dramatic rumors will never be proven, and some of the quiet, bureaucratic decisions that enabled all of this will never become headline news. But enough is known, enough is documented, enough is on the record to say this much with certainty: those secret meetings were not accidents. They were deliberate, they were calculated, and they were part of a larger pattern that put the comfort of powerful men above the safety of vulnerable girls. So, yeah, when the next batch of files comes out, when the next photo surfaces, when the next transcript is unsealed, pay attention, not just to the shocking name drops in the viral clips, but to the structures they reveal. Look at who kept showing up. Look at who kept quiet. Look at who suddenly discovered their conscience only after the world forced their hand. Because for all the speeches and press releases and angry tweets, the real test is simple. Will the same people who once treated Jeffrey Epstein as an asset, including Donald Trump, ever face genuine accountability for the world they helped build around him? Or will they continue to slip through the cracks, rewriting their own histories while the rest of us argue over the fragments? That is where this story leaves us. Not with a neat ending, but with a question. Whether you are listening as a voter, a citizen, or just a human being who is tired of seeing the powerful escape the consequences of their choices, you have a role here. Listen carefully. Remember the patterns. And the next time a politician tells you he will reveal everything, ask yourself whose truth he is really trying to protect.